here today, including one of the scheduled presenters, but I'm trying to I will get her, Eliza's notes on Salvadorans to share with everybody. But then, okay, so if you'll remember, what we're talking about generally is this issue of recruiting and motivating people. I've noticed in a couple of your discussion responses and other things, there's a little bit of confusion with the term mobilizing, and also I would say there's a little bit of an issue just in terms of how it's used in the literature. Mobilizing, I think, just really means different things to different people. At its basic, it just means getting people to join your movement, right? So, are people mobilized? Then they show up at rallies, or and I saw a bit of this in. And I think it might have come out of, I maybe not, was not clear enough when I was talking about tote bags. But joining, and there I am touching my face, sorry. The thing with tote bags is people get tote bags for being slightly mobilized. Like, you're not like super mobilized. You're not like, if you have I see people who have PETA stickers or Sierra Club stickers, maybe they're not joining protests. Maybe they're not, marching on Washington for, the environment or for veganism, but there is at least a minimal level of mobilization there if you give your $10 to PETA and they send you, a sticker or a coffee mug in the mail. I mean, that's really minimal mobilization, but it is mobilization. It counts as having people in your movement, and to some, it really depends on, we're looking a lot, obviously, at some really intensive mobilization today, really dangerous risk-taking activities. That's a different level of magnitude from, say, an organization like the International Society. Have I talked about these people with the International Society for the Preservation of Barbershop Music, right? That's a social movement organization. All the mobilization they want, is you send them a check, and it makes a difference, especially in the nonprofit environment in the United States, to just be able to say, like, look, this many people support us. Because if you then do that, you then have more access to grants from the government or from larger organizations. So really, some minimal mobilization is often all that an organization wants from you. We could also, though, and we see, I think especially, with like the Salvadoran case, for some movements, and certainly for some movement analysts, mobilization means big things, means like, were people mobilized to go and sit in at a lunch counter? Were people mobilized to physically take part in a protest? So the mobilization question can go there as well. In some of the rubric or the rhetoric that I'm seeing, it's the early, what I was talking about before, being in a movement, that's recruitment, you've been recruited, and actually like taking physical actions is mobilization. But again, you're going to see mobilization having a fairly broad definition or a broad application depending on who's talking about it. Clearly, though, with the student movement, we're talking about mobilization as, did you show up at the protest at the library, for the they're not Sandinistas. Who are they? They're the FMLN. The question is, did you take up arms? Were you mobilized on that level? Okay, then moving on. Maddie, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I just need to share my presentation with you guys on the screen, and then I should be good to go if you're all set.
Yeah, go for it.
So can you guys see my PowerPoint? Yes? Okay, cool. So I'm going to be talking about Chapter 10 that we read today, Generating Commitment Among Students by Hirsch. So the first thing that we're going to talk about with this is the actual group processes, the model that he talks about, and outlining the 4 points that he goes into. So the first point is conscious raising, and that is discussion involved to create and reinforce beliefs that develop an ideological commitment to the group, to their cause outside of institutional means. And they are doing this because the institutional means of influence have been unsuccessful. So they've gone through petitions or governmental forms of trying to change these things, and it's not working. So these discussions and conscious raising is facilitated in non-hierarchical, loosely structured face-to-face settings that are isolated from these people in power. And they're facilitating this discussion that it questions the legitimacy of the institution, and it's creating and reinforcing patterns of beliefs that make people more sympathetic to their cause because they want those beliefs to align with the group cause, and that can lead to commitment and mobilization. The next point is collective empowerment, which is large numbers of people are willing to sacrifice themselves for the movement, so the chances for success seem greater. Because the real test for the movement, it comes at the actual protest site to see how many people are really willing to take those risks associated with challenging authority rather than all the people who just donate money and talk about these kinds of issues. He mentions the bandwagon effect in this section. So that is, if large numbers of people are willing to participate and sacrifice themselves for the movement, then chances for success seem much greater. The presumed ability for the group to accomplish their goals is the biggest factor in this. The next one is polarization, and that is the sense of crisis in a movement strengthens the participants' belief that their fate is tied to that of the group rather than the threat to the individual needs. So in questioning the rules and the methods of those in charge, there's always uncertainty about how those people will respond to your new unconventional methods, and you're not going through the traditional means of challenging authority. So sufficient group authority or identification is formed from both conscious raising and collective empowerment, and that leads the protesters to respond as a powerful and angry group rather than as an isolated and frightened individual. And the sense of crisis that participants can feel from the other authority can make them believe that their fate is tied to the rest of the group. And the willingness to continue the protest despite personal risks because they feel the cost should be collectively shared. And the final piece of the group process that Hirsch talks about is collective decision-making. So that is group decisions about whether to initiate, continue, or to end a given protest, because participation in the protest movement is the result of complex group decision-making process, and it's not the consequence of many isolated, rational individual decisions. And it's important for ensuring continued participation. So now that we've highlighted the 4 parts of the group process model, we're going to look at the case study that Hirsch highlights with Columbia University's divestment campaign, and we're going to break down some of their actions by looking at the pieces of the group process model. But first, we're going to look at a little bit of background on the group and the goals of their movement. So the Columbia divestment campaign was run by an organization on campus called the Coalition for a Free South Africa. was founded in 1981. Their belief in this was that Columbia University was an accomplice in apartheid because it invested in the stock of these companies, and that divestment would advance the anti-apartheid movement by putting economic and political pressure on the white regime of South Africa. So their mission was to promote Columbia's divestment of stock in those businesses in South Africa. And they did this over a number of years. I said they were founded in 1981. They didn't actually hold this protest until a couple of years later. And one of the most important factors I think about the protests that they actually hold is that majority of the protesters had not been previously active in any divestment campaign or any other campus protests. So they got them mobilized even though they never really had been before. So the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to break down Columbia's divestment campaign run by this organization into the 4 group process points. So first we're going to talk about conscious raising, and CFSA, they did this in small group settings, they did this in dorm events and teach-ins like we've talked about, and they got coverage of their events in the student newspaper. So these 2 things were on-campus factors that led to student awareness of the issue, and off-campus factors that led to student awareness of apartheid issues was through big media coverage of the actual repression and anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So all those things factor into the students and what they know about the anti-apartheid movement. One of the things that happened that was really significant before the actual protest was in 1983, CFSA, they accomplished a unanimous vote for divestment by administration, faculty, and student representatives in the university senate. So they accomplished this, and it was rejected by Columbia's Board of Trustees. So this is a big turning point in CFSA and their quest for divestment because it led to the rejection of traditional means for change. Since they went through the traditional means, they went through the Senate and they got approval for it, but it was rejected. So it pushed them towards a protest movement. And the result of their extensive organizing work was that many students were aware of the oppressed state of Black Africans in South Africa, and then the call for divestment by anti-apartheid activists, and the lack of accountability of the university president and the trustees in the face of a unanimous vote for divestment by the representative body at the university. The next part of the group process model was collective empowerment, and CFSA sponsored rallies and vigils to call attention to the inaction of the trustees after this vote in 1983. So they did this the next couple of years, and they had few students attend because few thought that this would accomplish the goal of divestment. So this led to a plan for their initial protest plan for chaining the doors shut and protesters occupying the space. Their intended result of this protest was it to be symbolic. They wanted to draw media coverage and dramatize the continuing fight for divestment. So on April 4th, they held the initial rally with 200 students in attendance. And first it was speeches made by the students, local political figures. They even had someone from the African National Congress there. And it was followed by a march around campus, which ended in the front steps of the Change building. And after that whole speech process and then the marches, they finally revealed their occupation plan to the students that they were not going to leave until the university divested its stock. And they did not expect students to stay since participation in other vigils were minimal, since they had 9% relative participation before the blockade, but they ended up having 37% student participation in the blockade. And they attribute that to belief in the cause and the means that maybe this protest might work. And the fact that there were a couple hundred of people out there gave a lot of people the feeling that this might work. Like that's the bandwagon effect right there, because all of these people are around you think, okay, maybe this protest will make a difference. And belief in that power was reinforced by personal risks that were taken by the leaders of the movement. The leaders were fasting in order to hold a meeting with the president. The South African students talking at these events faced exile and imprisonment for speaking at the rally if they ever went back to South Africa. And so by demonstrating their own commitment to the cause over individual risks, other students ignored their own personal interests for the blockade as well. And the protesters were not really forced to decide to join the blockade because the march ended where it did. They were then led they were led there. So their choice was, should they leave the blockade? It wasn't an active choice of participating in the movement. It was an active choice of not participating in the movement. The next one is polarization. And this was accomplished because the administration did not order arrests like the CFSA thought they were going to. Instead, they sent a letter to the university calling the students disruptive and attempting to impose their will on the rest of the university interests and everything. They also had individual threats of suspension and expulsion. They targeted influential members of the protest, hoping that they would leave to go attend these hearings and such. But this just made people more angry and strengthened their resolve to stay and to continue with the protest. So the protesters responded as a group to administrative threats and not as isolated individuals. Each blockader saw their welfare tied to the cause and the achievement of the movement's goals. They had a collective consciousness. They felt like if they left, they would let these people down, and they didn't want to do that. And some other costs for participating in the protest included the weather, the cold and the freezing rain, because students did sleep on the steps. They were missing classes, exams, and study time, and losing relationships with non-blockaders were also polarizing factors. And the final piece of the group process was collective decision-making, and the CFSA accomplished this during their blockade by holding votes concerning the main question of whether or not to continue this protest, because blockaders would be more likely to continue the protest if they participated in the collective decision to do so. The first 2 weeks, the consensus was to continue the protest, so they kept it going. There were still a lot of students present at the steps. And by the third week, though, they were reevaluating how the protest was accomplishing their goals. The sense of crisis had been dulled by the lack of action by the administration to back up their threats. Their threats of expulsion and stuff didn't really come through, so that threat was really gone. And then they weren't making any moves to dispel the protesters. They were hoping to wait them out. And the protest accomplished the goal of media coverage. There was a lot of media coverage initially, but an event can only hold that media attention for so long. So taking these factors into account, they decided that the blockade had done a lot, but at this point, other things would be better to pursue since the administration was willing to wait them out on this. So results of the campaign, the blockade ended 3 weeks later on April 25th, and then Colombia divested 5 months later. So the protest didn't accomplish the huge goal of causing divestment right away. They didn't occupy until divestment. It happened a little bit later, but they still accomplished that goal. And as a side note, global pressure and economic sanctions eventually led to dismantling of apartheid as a whole in the 1990s. So their mission and their premonitions about how economic sanctions were going to help end apartheid were partially correct, and they hoped to continue to aid that movement with Colombia's divestment. So one of the questions that someone asked on Moodle that I thought was really important was, if the protest had been continued after 3 weeks, like, would it have achieved its goals sooner? And that's a good question that we really can never know the answer to. But the goals of this protest, they were to generate media coverage and symbolic support. So it accomplished those goals in the 3 weeks. And the goal of the movement as a whole was divestment, was not accomplished at the end of those 3 weeks, like we've seen, but it was accomplished later on, and I don't think it was really meant to be accomplished by that protest. But the protest demonstrates that participants are the most important piece of a social movement. Mobilization is very important. Their commitment is everything. So listening to them when they decided enough is enough, I think, was more beneficial to their goals in the long run than extending the protest would have been. And finally, I want to look at this question that was brought up in the reading. And Hirsch asks, why do some tactics appear to offer a greater chance of success than others? And you don't have to respond to this question. I just thought it's a good question to consider when we look at movement tactics, because they went from trying the institutional means in the university senate to a big protest movement, and why was one more successful than the other one, potentially. So yeah, that was my presentation.
Very good. Very good. Does anybody want to chime in the chat with that? I mean, why did a sit-in work better than? I mean, and it's like you said, it's measures of success are interesting. They had already seemingly been successful in being able to convince the faculty senate and the university president to go along with divestment, but then they got blocked at that level of the trustees. Why do we consider the sit-in a success, or why does that ultimately prove to be what is and by the way, this is going back to my childhood even, but even as a child, I do remember this event. Like, this was a huge media event, and the nightly news was covering, like, look at all these kids at Columbia saying, oh, you got it. So just on that level, there's some success. Why those tactics? Why do they appeal to people? Do you have anything to say about that? It's hard to run an online class. Okay, well, again, maybe just think about that for yourself, right? Think about why, and I think it's probably something about why people putting themselves physically in situations is appealing to people in some sense of the word. Certainly, though, from a media spectacle standpoint, you can think about this in a similar frame to the lunch counter sit-ins. It makes for great visuals. Kids freezing their asses off on the steps of, I guess, the library at Columbia. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember the Columbia Library? Do you remember seeing this when, I forget? No, that was somebody else. It shows up from time to time, right? Because it does have this real marquee library building in Manhattan. It's just a visually striking space, right? So some movements have access to things like that. Just a couple other things I wanted to highlight here. You did a great job, Maddie, by the way. The bandwagon effect, Hirsch seems to really frame it in a sort of a social psychological term, and I guess that is a good important way to frame it. The other way to look at it, though, that I would encourage is as a tipping point, and this kind of got a little I don't know what you'd call it, popularized recently. If you're one of those people who read Malcolm Gladwell, which I'm not really myself, but he's one of these guys who kind of takes social scientific findings and repackages them in kind of I guess friendly prose for popular audiences. But he had I think he called the book "The Tipping Point." Several years back, and that's essentially the idea with the bandwagon effect that Hirsch is highlighting here. The way I understand Hirsch, and maybe you can correct me if I'm little off base here, Maddie, is that he's essentially saying that people hop on the bandwagon for this protest because they feel that there would be social pressure, or they would lose the admiration of their peers, or if they don't protest, or maybe, or simultaneously, it feels good to be on a bandwagon. And if you think about it, well, yeah, dude, I mean, I'm not sure exactly of the historical origins of the term bandwagon, but if you think of like a parade float, like who wouldn't want to be on a parade float with a band, right? That sounds like fun. It looks like a good time. You know, it's an enjoyable thing at that point to participate in. I think that's how Hirsch is reading the bandwagon effect. Like it feels good. It's an emotionally positive experience. On the other hand, the tipping point literature is really a properly rational choice literature. And I think we should consider it, at least to some extent, in the context of this article, or consider the article in this context. So the idea here is that that everybody has a sort of a tipping point, or there's well, different articles frame it differently. You know, there are some articles that argue like there is a specific tipping point at which everybody like does something. Che's article, Michael Che's article, is the, you know, for me really the kind of the gold standard on this thing. And his suggestion is that different people have different tipping points, and the suggestion there really is that above, well, I guess I should say N participants, above a certain number of participants, participation makes sense. And often what that boils down to is, again, for rational choice, you know, we're talking about cost-benefit analyses. And really what this is boiling down to is the potential cost is probably less for individuals. And, you know, I don't know if you've, Che applies it to things like rioting, right? I don't know if you've been in a riot before. You probably haven't. They're relatively unusual these days. But the idea is, well, but you know, you've probably had some experience of bandwagons in like high school. Like if you had like senior skip day, you know, if just 3 or 4 people are skipping, and you get caught, you know, you're going to detention, you know, for however long, something like that. If the entire senior class skips, you know that you're probably safe, right? So your participation cost goes down significantly. So you kind of just figure, like, you know, if it's just me and my 3 friends skipping, like we might pay a hefty cost. If it's me and 10 friends skipping, the cost might go down, right? If the entire class joins in, there's barely any cost at all. And basically with certain kinds of mobilization, especially certain kinds of really, semi-risky protests, that's what we see going on. So above, and Che's point with this is that different people have different what you call it, proclivities or thresholds or really tipping points, different numbers of people above whom they feel they are safe, or that their risks are lowered enough that they'll participate. And that's kind of the great thing about this Colombia protest that they're saying is, they kind of stumbled into this tactic to guarantee that there were, I don't know, not guarantee, but to ensure at that point that there were so many people participating in this lock-in, lock-out sit-in that everybody would join in. They would say, well, it's not, if it's just 4 or 5 of us, then we know that the administration might expel us, whatever. If it's 30% of the student body doing this, the chances of effective retaliation are much lower. So again, Hirsch is framing it in these emotive senses. I think we should also consider in these rational choice terms. Good stuff. And also just on the polarizing thing, I would like you to note too that he doesn't, obviously he takes it from the standpoint of the protesters, right? So when the protesters experience this polarization, and essentially that's to say they experience the administration casting things in these really black and white terms, like you guys are the bad guys and you're going to be in all kinds of trouble, and they start threatening expulsions and whatnot. That energizes the protesters. Also should kind of, for you, be a way of thinking about how authorities respond to protest and what measured or intelligent responses look like. So I know we've had, I think it's kind of a little bit before your time now, we've talked about this campus divesting from fossil fuels, right? And rather than, and of course, there hasn't been like quite the level of protest where the administration would threaten expulsions for anybody like that. Not sure that Eckert's the kind of place that would do that ever. But one tactic that they've had is to always listen, right? Never demonize their opponents. Never say divesting from fossil fuels is stupid or wrong-headed or whatever it is, and always appear to do some things about it, right? So they'll say, well, we'll have the trustees look into it and we'll buy into this fund. We're not going to completely divest because that's just not practical, whatever. But again, the point is that they go out of their way. And I think that the most administrations, know this nowadays. You go out of your way not to polarize, not to antagonize student protesters, right? Not to try to make them the bad guys, because we know that if you make somebody else the bad guys, they will, potentially engage in really disruptive protests, and you'll build more solidarity, more of that kind of collective identity amongst the protesters. the other, there was one more thing. Well, right, yeah, of course, they do. The administration does, right, not actually want to divest from. I'm just looking at the chat here. Lena's saying, so they get money from these companies. Yeah, of course, the administration does not want to divest from all fossil fuels because it is a way to make money. And so we do still have investments in those industries because that is a way to make money and grow that endowment. So they are, of course, very loath to, but if they can appear to work with the protesters, right? And this is also, by the way, a general problem for social movements is do movement leaders get co-opted, or does the movement get co-opted by the authority figures? And it can be a very effective tactic. So people argued, if you remember looking back at the OWS stuff, it's like, well, everybody expected Obama and the progressives would really do all these kinds of things when they got into power. And of course they didn't. But, at the same time, we say like, well, look, they got into the power structure. They got things that they wanted. So now they're much less radical than they were to begin with. Right. And so that's often a concern for movements, right? Is this co-optation, and really what that is, we could frame that in Hirsch's terms as avoiding polarization, because I think he's quite right. He makes the point, hard to generalize some of this stuff, but I think polarization is definitely a generalizable point. When you make a movement seem like the bad guys, it gives them very few outs, very few sort of tactics that they could claim a partial victory through. But then, as he says, it also reinforces that collective identity. Everybody says like, wow, we're in it together because they said, it's not just me looking around my friends saying like, we're a group, I like you guys, we're doing the right thing. It's, the big bad authority figures say, you're all together, you're one thing. And that reflects back on like, okay, that's an identity now that I can claim. So good. So if you ever find yourself in university administration, don't threaten to expel the protesters. Just give them candy and blankets and they'll go away. Don't do that. Take them seriously. Okay. Then there's also, I guess this kind of maybe is a transition point. There's this next article is all about agency, or is largely about agency. And that's, I want to say, a problem for sociology right now. It's been an ongoing problem in sociology for some time, since at least the 1990s. We've had a lot of discussion over really what we call, the structure versus agency debate. And what that essentially is to say that, when we say structure, we're saying, you do things, people, individuals do things because either that's the way it's done, or, which is essentially the same tradition. Why do you eat? Did you have ham on Thanksgiving or not? Easter? Did you have Easter hams? Anybody? Anybody have an Easter ham? No. You know about Easter ham, though, right? Easter ham's a thing, right? Well, why have ham on Easter? Well, it's just what you do, right? Why do you have a turkey on Thanksgiving? We didn't have to think about it. You go to Publix, and there's like 3,000 turkeys in the freezer case, and you're like, oh, get a turkey. It's like 12 cents a pound or something. Plain pasta. Oh no, Corona Easter. I'm sorry. Ugh. Yes, we'll be better. We'll be better next year. But maybe you thought like, oh, we should be having ham. So you do things because that's the way it's done, or there's a sort of a more almost insidious way of looking looking at it, which is to say that it's because various aspects of social structure. I don't want to quite put it this way, but I will, because the social structure makes you do it. And I want to say that's essentially the way that Hirsch framed that bit about leaving the protest. From this standpoint, arguably he misframed it. The way that he discussed it was that people felt that in general, leaving or participating or non-participating is a choice. And he framed people staying at the sit-in at Columbia as a difficult choice, and that the choice would be to not leave. From the standpoint of a really structured sociology, the argument would almost be that they didn't really have a choice because of various aspects of their personal psychologies, and because of the social structure of the protest and the power structures. There really wasn't a choice to leave at that point. And that the structure, ultimately, again, both the broader social structure, but also the internal mental structures of those students, made it so that they really couldn't leave. We oppose that generally to agency, which is free will and choice. And for a long time, relatively long time, starting in the 80s, really picked up a lot of speed in the 90s. Really a lot of writing about this in sociology in the 90s. There are people who kind of want to rescue a notion of agency, rescue us from the sense that we only do things because society socializes us in a certain way and social structures are built up in a certain way, such that we would be slaves to the structure. And so there's this big effort, and you see it a lot in Elizabeth Wood, in Wood's article about the Salvadoran rebel movement, right? The Salvadoran insurgency. And she's saying, what's going on there is that Salvadorans are exercising free will, or exercising the choice, like they have a real choice. You can pick up a gun and go shoot people, or you cannot pick up a gun, right? You can choose to participate or to not participate. nowadays, there is actually a kind of a blowback, or a return to structural thinking. There is increasing pessimism about the possibilities of human agency, and also, and this isn't to say that people don't behave in all kinds of unpredictable ways. It's just that they do behave, ultimately in patterned ways where the structure of their socialization and experiences comes up against ever-changing social structures. And so they have to, respond in novel ways. But those novel ways are not truly agency. They're not true choices, but those are just, the kind of the result of two structures running into each other, right? The socialization structure running into a new social structure. And, what this ultimately suggests is that that society trends towards patterning, trends towards stability, stasis, etc. And the really strong version of questioning agency, or some strong versions of questioning agency, point out, or at least argue, that this is an Augustinian concept, right? So I don't think, and I really haven't done enough of the reading of what is the Confessions of Saint Augustine, but the argument, and there is a decent historical record to back this up, is the argument is that free will as a concept is a Christian invention, and that we should specifically trace most of that to Saint Augustine, who, and I guess the point for Augustine, as I recall, is that he was a naughty young man, a very venal. He liked to engage in sex and drinking and partying and whatever, and that he then kind of saw the light and was turned toward Christ, sometime like late in his 20s or something like that, and became a very devout priest. But then what Augustine's take on that is that God has given you free will to choose between, sinning or the saintly life, and that it is all of our duty to consciously, freely choose to walk the path of God, that kind of thing, and that has been really deeply influential in Western society. And is not really as much part of Eastern society still, was not particularly a part, if you go back, and again, this is an argument, but if you go back to, like Homer, you go back to the Iliad, the Odyssey, you don't see people really making choices. Gods make some choices, and people are just sort of slaves to, again, mostly their venal impulses, right? So why do we start the Trojan Wars? Because somebody thinks Helen should be his girlfriend, right? So it's not necessarily, an intransigent part, a permanent part of human society, that we would believe in agency. And some people, again, are now arguing that really we're acting on structure, and the way that this is often cast nowadays is in terms of type 1 and type 2 cognition. Where type 1 is fast and unconscious, it really is the bulk of our thinking, and type 2 is slow and conscious, but often, well, but not something we very often use. It's actually pretty rare, right? And so this is all, sorry, kind of a long pseudo digression, right? And as a way of setting up this discussion of the Salvadorans here. And the point with the Salvadorans is, you know, it's of course it's interesting, it's important that she goes into you know, the discussion of rational choice, political opportunities versus emotive renderings of participation. So, you know, the first big point here that we should consider is that people participate in movements because of material benefits, excuse me. You know, and she points out that with respect to the Salvadoran movement in particular, free riding was broadly possible, right? So if you don't take up arms, you know, there is a fairly significant part of the population that does not take up arms and that merely free rides, that gets, you know, more land or gets liberated from the, I forget what they call it, the hacienda system, essentially, you know, so having a landlord who really controls you. You could be liberated from that by the FMLN, but you didn't have to participate in the FMLN. And so then the puzzle becomes, well, why do people participate when they could so effectively free ride? And she dives down to the level of emotional benefits. That there are certain benefits that you can accrue by participation which you would not be able to accrue by non-participation. And that's an important perspective that we have to take seriously. That you know, this is, and this again goes back to things that Almeida was summarizing. You know, essentially that we need to get away from the purely material reasoning to understand that there are emotional and psychological reasonings that that undergird people's decisions to participate in movements. So again, this point here from Wood, that participation is rooted in emotional and psychological benefits. As opposed to material benefits. The participation in the movement itself feels good. Sorry, emotional and psychological benefits, right? Participating itself feels good, and you can't get those good, positive feelings unless you participate. Then, so she takes this other step, and this is where I think, well, one might have an argument, and I don't have access to these folks, right? And so we'd have to look at the notes and everything and see what people really said, how these stories really work. Her argument is, well, participation, meaning joining with the FMLN, joining in the insurgency against the government and the landowners, is equivalent to, or is a form of agency, and is therefore it therefore carries with it certain emotional benefits. It causes feelings of dignity or pride. Again, here, and maybe this is, to bring this too much into, the academic arguments, but this is just stuff that's really been on my mind a lot the last couple of years, as this has really, kind of taken quite a bit of hold in sociological debates. A real question for this kind of material is agency and dignity, especially, retroactively assigned. And therefore, the logical argument that goes along with that is, are the reasons for participating more structured? So, by saying retroactively assigned, what I mean is, did people think this way in the moment when they were deciding to participate, or even at a really more extreme level, did they actually decide to participate? Or were certain individuals, were the participants themselves sort of carried along by this conjuncture of personal biography and structural conditions to participate in the movement? In a sense, was their participation inevitable? We had a little bit of that sense last time when we talked about the Salvadorans, in terms of things, with the women's participation, in terms of things like certain young women especially felt that there was almost no choice. That, with and I'm kind of fitting this into the narrative, but were their experiences, was their community structured in such a way that there was really no choice for a woman? Remember, they were talking about like able-bodied young women without children. really didn't have a choice to participate. It was just the thing to do. And this is, again, this is with this literature on cognition and agency that's really, it's an active debate in sociology. So, a lot of us still want to believe explanations like Wood's, that people do have free choices to make and exercise agency and change their world for the better. A lot of folks are pretty doubtful about this, and she addresses a bit of this in talking about how there is a problem with retrospective interviewing. To ask somebody, 2 or 4 or 5 years down the line, why did you do that thing? And again, the argument from this new literature on structure and on cognitive structure suggests that people don't really know why they do things. People do things because their minds are structured in a certain way, and society is structured in a certain way. Where a lot of this originally comes from is actually in like consumer choice literature, economic literature. So a lot of this type 1 thinking is things like, why do you buy? I'm trying to think of like things where the generic is just as good as the name brand. Medicine. Right. Medicine is clearly an example here. I was going to say pasta, but like I'm pretty sure I can tell the difference between like Barilla pasta and generic Publix pasta, right? Like Publix pasta, not quite as good, just a little gluey or whatever. With some things there really are legitimate differences between the generic and the store brand. But consistently, we find people putting a higher value or exercising the choice to spend more money and buy the name brand. And that's a demonstrably bad choice with most medicine, right? Most of the time, almost all of the time, the generic is just as good, if not identical, to the name brand. So like buying, again, Bayer brand aspirin versus, Publix or Hannaford or whatever. Walmart, what is it? Walmart is President's Choice, right? I don't know. I don't go to Walmart much. They must have generic aspirin at Walmart. I don't know if it's President's Choice. Anyway, the point being, why do people pay extra for buy the name brand stuff? And the argument, in the economic literature is that it's a bias. You've been advertised to. You've been taught to believe that things with name brands must be better, and so you'll buy that stuff without really thinking, without taking the two things. You should do this, right? As a consumer, take 2 medicines, put them next to each other, and you'll notice that the generic is identical to the store brand. So pay less money and buy the store brand. What does that all have to do with political participation? Well, the argument here is that, if you ask somebody, why did you choose the store brand? They'll tell you like, it's better. I know it's better. They'll come up with shit. They'll make shit up. They don't even know they're making shit up. They'll make shit. Studies show that stuff is better. Similarly, right, that could be and some, again, this is an active debate. Some people argue more strenuously one way or the other. That could really be what's underlying people's explanations, their post hoc explanations of why they do things. And so there is, a pretty active movement, I would say now, in, at least among some people, in research methods, to say that, like, asking people to provide reasons for is not a fruitful interview method, because people will always come up with a reason that they did something, and it may not, or arguably frequently does not, represent why they actually did do the thing. Now, that being said, I'm not sure that those folks are right. So, it may well be, and clearly Wood found, right, amongst her informants, those folks did literally say, I joined because, I got dignity out of the movement. And that may be, even if the cognitive structure of people are right, it's still important to know that is part of the retrospective culture. The argument now is like, we gained pride from it, blah, blah, blah. I would just caution us to say, maybe it's more like what, I want to say Valenta, that's not the name though. More like what, misplaced everything. More like what Viterna was writing about. It's, maybe more that the structure pushed people into participating in the movement. Okay, so that's, again, all kind of a bit of a digression, but again, something we kind of have to put more into the picture. Is very much in the picture in cultural sociology right now. I don't think it's yet come as much into the movement's literature, although it's it's going to be there. Right, you're going to have some idea of this. And also practically, right? Because I know not too many of you are necessarily going to go on and become movements researchers, but practically, that does have to be a sort of a consideration for you. Is if it's not as much about convincing people, through logical arguments, then should you be making sort of arguments or doing things marketing-wise for your movement that sort of call upon these deep structures, get people to act upon less than conscious biases that they have, right? And that doesn't have to be on something as fraught as the decision to have a revolt. And again, something more, that can point both ways in Wood's reading here is that participation was rooted in a Christian and indigenous cosmology? Cosmology. And again, there's two different ways to take this. So this is the argument that people joined the movement because they fundamentally saw the hacienda system as being wrong. They fundamentally understood the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a very few rich people as being very wrong. This is, it goes to, I guess in the indigenous thing is, sort of like, we don't own, you can't own the land owns you. So, knowing it just doesn't make sense to have individual landowners with this kind of control. The more Christian way of rendering this is in things like Mark, of like, it's easier for a rich person. No, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to go through the gates of heaven. That there's something just fundamentally wrong about people accruing that much wealth. Again, two ways to read that. She reads that as that activates people's sense of agency, sense of wrong, and it encourages them to consciously make the decision to participate in a movement. From the more structural side, though, again, the reading that we could have is that because concentrated land ownership doesn't make sense, it's almost an inevitable choice for people who are like maybe more or less strongly steeped in that Christian or indigenous cosmology. It's almost like they're just guided down that path, that they dive in, there's no choice to do something else. It doesn't make any sense to them. Okay. And again, hey, sorry. Again, we're some question about the retrospectivity here. She argues that, and it's something to at least put in our toolboxes either way. That, how does she put it? Overcoming fear requires breaking the sense of the inertia of repression. So we tend to have a sense that, and this is really in all political structures, or not just political structures, really in all of life. This is a general precept, really, of interactionist sociology, that you think that tomorrow is going to be like today. That's inertia, right? Or you're really, in other ways, it's inevitability. I'm going to wake up tomorrow. Kafka's story about the metamorphosis is essentially, the refutation of this. Gregor Samsa awoke one morning to discover that he turned into a bug. You just don't expect that. You never expect to turn into a bug. It's a metaphor, obviously, but it really speaks to how we experience life. We expect that everything will be the same as it was yesterday. When you wake up tomorrow, the world will be more or less like it was the day before. And she says that to get over the fear of participation is to get over that sense of the inevitability of repression. So if you can do something to be, and McAdam has referred to this in some works as a cognitive liberation. If you believe the world can be another way, if it doesn't have to be inevitably the way that it is, then you can do things to change it, or then you'll want to participate in a movement, or then you'll want to, more specifically, grab your Kalashnikov and shoot at government forces because, like, maybe the world can be a different place. Again, that's a very agentic point of view. Which and it may the reality may belie that statement. Again, I don't really know. It's hard to know if people weren't actually being sort of channeled along a path, if there weren't, the way that Marx put it, was that there were certain contradictions inherent in a system that concentrates wealth so much that it had to break. That's a very different way of positing this, but we should take seriously, at least, like I say, to have it in our toolkit, that it's possible for a social movement like a rebel movement like this, or McAdam talked about it in terms of the civil rights movement. It's possible for a movement to disrupt that sense of inevitability. It's possible for a movement to make you believe that tomorrow, if you play your cards right, you might wake up as a bug. Okay, that's the metaphor, right? But in terms of something like the civil rights movement, it's possible for you to believe that your actions might effectively break the arrangements of Jim Crow, or for the FMLN that participating in insurgency might break the hold of these hacienda owners over land use in El Salvador. Okay. I think that is, really, kind of where we want to be from that for today. For now, are there questions? So looking ahead to next time, we will be talking about Chapter 7 in Almeida, and that will be moving us on to questions about movement outcomes. So this should get you pretty close to like all the background you need to get those case studies going. Again, get really plugging on those as much as possible. I hope folks aren't, overstressing you with additional work. I've heard some of that's going on. If you're having personal issues, troubles, etc., getting things done or with the balancing act, please let me know. Otherwise, keep plugging away at it. And I will see you on Thursday. Is there any way I can take a picture of the board? Oh, this is, so Lena, this is all recorded, right? So in an hour or so, this will all be on YouTube. Okay, cool. I'll see you guys on Thursday.